Hello guys, today I'll be giving you a video on how to get into Fear Factory. Now this is of course all my opinion. Now just because a certain album isn't in a certain category doesn't mean that I like an album less or more than this album or that album. If you want to know more about which albums I like more or less than this album or that album, definitely check out my Fear Factory albums ranked video. It is on my channel, so definitely check it out if you haven't seen it already if you're interested. But anyways, let's go ahead and dive into this. We got four categories. We have must listen slash start, which is what we're going to start off with, of course. And then we got give me more, and then deep dive, and then cautious but give a chance. So let's go ahead and get started and start off with must listen slash start. And the albums I'm going to be doing for this category are Demanufacture and Obsolete. So let's first talk about Demanufacture. Definitely a defining album for this band, often considered their best, and understandably so. With this album, you get a good idea of what Fear Factory is all about and what they offer musically. And overall, it's a strong album. Some people say it's a landmark album in the 90s, and understandably so, of course. I mean, the mix of industrial and metal music with like sci-fi themes, because you do have themes of like man versus machine and stuff like that. But the first five songs, especially, are really strong. The title track, Self-Biased Resistor, Zero Signal, and Replica, and New Breed. New Breed is a short, catchy, heavy song that has some nice tempo slash rhythm work. But if you want to start off with a song from this band, like from this album, I'd start off with maybe Replica or Self-Biased Resistor. But yeah, also the second half I think is pretty strong too, with songs like Flashpoint, HK Hunter Killer, and Piss Christ. Hunter Killer is probably my favorite of the second half. I think that's a really strong song overall, and maybe my favorite of the second half. But yeah, definitely start off with this album if you want to get a good idea of what this band is all about. So that is why they're in the must listen slash start. So let's go ahead and talk about Obsolete. So with this album, if you want to start off with something more straightforward, maybe start off with this album. I mean, commercially, this is maybe their biggest album. And some of my favorites on the album are probably Shock, Edge Crusher, and Descent, Freedom or Fire. And their cover of Cars is pretty good. Maybe a cover that might not be for everybody, but for me, I do like it. But the album does have some pretty strong deep tracks like High Tech Hate and Freedom or Fire. Freedom or Fire, I think, is one of their most underrated songs. You can tell that they kind of experimented a little bit with that song, especially like in the verses. Definitely kind of a unique song on the album to me. But yeah, if you want to start off with certain songs from the album, I'd start off with songs like Edge Crusher, or if you want something to maybe a bit more melodic, maybe start off with a song like Descent. If you want to get more familiar with like maybe the hits from the band, I'd maybe go with songs like Cars, or the cover of Cars, or Shock, or Descent. Those are good songs to start off with if you're again interested in the more commercial side of the band. But yeah, this album, commercially, again, a big album for them, and to me, a must listen for this band if you're trying to get into them. So that's it for must listen slash start. That's it for that category. Let's go ahead and move on to Give Me More. So we're going to go ahead and dive into these three albums here: Digimortal, Mechanize, and Genexus. So let's first start off with Digimortal. Now, this album is kind of divisive within the fan base, because the band was accused of going nu metal with this album. And there's no rapping in this album except for one song. That song, of course, being Back the F Up, which is track number 8. Maybe a song that might not go well with all listeners, but for me, I think it's kind of catchy, even if it does sound a bit dated. But the biggest song on the album is Linchpin, so if you want to start off with certain songs from the album, I'd start off with songs like the title track or Linchpin, or what will become, or if you want something a bit more melodic slash unique, maybe the album closer or Invisible Moons, Dark Bodies. Those are some other highlights on the album, but even the more heavier tracks on the album I think are pretty strong too, and definitely worth checking out, like Damaged or Acres of Skin, because this is another album that has some pretty strong deep cuts. But yeah, the album, a bit more simplistic in their discography compared to some of their other albums, but I'd say I'd put it in this category rather than Deep Dive, because I mean it is one of my personal favorites. I mean, when it comes to new metal, I do like a lot of new metal. Not all of it, but I do like a good amount of it. So if you're a new metal fan, you'll probably enjoy some things from this album, or maybe the whole thing. But yeah, gonna have to put this album in this category. But yeah, definitely an album worth checking out if you already enjoy Demanufacture and Obsolete. If you're not into Demanufacture or Obsolete, then you might not be able to get into their other albums. But anyways, let's go and move on to the next album with Mechanize. This album was kind of a return for them, because the previous album was kind of divisive for the band, and they were going through some things during that time of that album, which we'll get to that album later. But with this album, it's a nice return. You definitely get plenty of heaviness in this album, especially with songs like Power Shifter and Fear Campaign and the title track. But get into the second half and you get some pretty nice deep cuts slash gems. Oxidizer, I think, is a really good song. But you also have the song Final Exit, which is of course the album closer, and that's maybe one of their best album closers, or maybe one of their best songs in general. Definitely a unique song. If you're a sci-fi type of person, definitely check out that song and another song from the album that we'll talk about next after this one. But yeah, if you're really into the heavy side slash thrashy, more up-tempo side of Fear Factory, then you'll probably enjoy this album. But yeah, definitely an album worth checking out. But now we're going to go ahead and move on to Genexus, which is their latest album. This album to me is their best of their modern work in terms of songwriting, and just due to how fresh it sounds, it doesn't feel like a rehash. There is one album in their discography that I do think kind of sounds like a rehash a little bit, but still good, and we'll get to that album later. But with this album, you have highlights like Autonomous Combat System. The title track I think is really good. Expiration Date is the song that I think is worth checking out, especially if you're into sci-fi, like if you're into movies like Blade Runner or Terminator. Definitely check out that song. Listening to that song for the first time is definitely an interesting experience for sure. The album does also have some strong singles like Dielectric and Protomech, both really good songs. But the lesser known songs on the album I think are really good too, like the more shorter song like Church of Execution, and Anodize is also a pretty good song. Maybe you could say it's standard Fear Factory, but still a solid song overall. But overall, a pretty strong album. If you want to check out the more modern stuff, I'd maybe start off with this album or Mechanize. But yeah, overall, pretty strong album. Let's go ahead and move on to the next category, Deep Dive. And we're going to go ahead and start off with The Industrialist. If I had to point to one album that I feel is maybe kind of a rehash of what they've done before, I'd probably go with this album, which isn't a bad thing. Or in some ways it's bad, or in some ways it's good. But there is some solid stuff on here. Not much to say about the album, but if you want to get really deep into this band, I definitely check out this album and the album after this one, and of course the other one, the last one we'll talk about. But this album, you have songs like Recharger and New Messiah and Virus of Fate that I think are really good songs. Probably the highlights of the album. But if you already like what you've heard from the previous albums that I've talked about in this video so far, then you'll probably enjoy this album. I don't think it's one of their best, but it does have some songs that are worth checking out. Not songs that I'd say you should skip. But yeah, The Industrialist. So let's go ahead and move on to Archetype. Now, of course, with this album, we did not have Dino Cazares. I hope I pronounced his last name correctly, but this album is definitely raw, heavy, and in your face. And with this album, they weren't really in their commercial peak during this time, and I believe they moved to a different label with this album, Liquid 8 Records, if I got the name right. But the first half of this album, I think, is really strong. If you like your metal raw and heavy and in your face, then you'll probably enjoy this album. And the album has a lot of attitude to it, especially when you listen to songs like Cyber Waste or Slave Labor, for example. But Act of God and Drones and Human Shields are pretty good songs that are more lesser known in their discography. Same with Corporate Cloning, maybe a more straightforward or traditional Fear Factory song, but that's one of my personal favorites on the album. If you really like the clean vocals from Burton, then you'll probably like the chorus from Corporate Cloning. The biggest song on the album is probably Archetype, so if you're into the more commercial side of the band, then you'll probably enjoy Archetype. Or if you like a mix of the more commercial side of the band with a more heavier side, then you'll again probably like the song Archetype or the title track, however you want to put it. But with this album, I would say that the second half is not as strong as the first half, but the second half does have some nice stuff, like again Human Shields. But yeah, Archetype by Fear Factory, pretty solid album, and kind of underrated too. But next we're going to go ahead and move on to Soul of a New Machine. This is the album that started it all for them. They were still trying to find their sound with this album, and you can tell, which is part of why it's not in the must listens or Give Me More. But if you like some death metal in your sound or in your music, then you'll probably enjoy this album. You kind of get a mix of like industrial and death metal. And this album was actually kind of groundbreaking, kind of a game changer in a way, because he had a mix of death metal vocals and clean vocals, which not many people around this time were doing. But in my opinion, I thought Burton C. Bell overall did pretty well with doing that in this album. But if you're looking for notable songs on the album, I'd point to songs like Martyr or Scapegoat. Scapegoat maybe being the best song on the album for me personally. Crash Test is pretty good. A fast, upbeat song that's really in your face, especially with some of the riffs. Then you have the song Suffrage, which does take its time building up. The intro does kind of remind me of the intro of Loco by Cold Chamber. And if you're a Cold Chamber fan, that's cool, but Suffrage I do think is overall maybe a more interesting song than Loco. But Loco is a decent song. But anyways, back to this album. WOE is another highlight on the album for me. A more shorter song, but overall pretty catchy and has some pretty catchy riffs and rhythm work too. The album does maybe feel a bit long, and the production might not go well with everybody because this is a pretty raw album. But I'd say it's an album worth checking out, especially if you want to get really deep into this band. But yeah, Soul of a New Machine by Fear Factory, pretty solid debut. And now we're finally at the end with the last category, Cautious But Give a Chance. And we only got one album here, and that album is Transgression. Now, this album, when you look into like the making of this album and what was going on within the band and their label and stuff like that, you can tell that they were kind of feeling rushed a bit, and you can definitely hear it with the final product, at least with some of the songs, because you do get some covers in this song, or not in this song, but in this album. But I'll be honest, the only song I return to from this album is the title track. The rest of the album overall isn't very memorable. Some decent moments here and there, but nothing that'll make me want to go back to it again and again. But the album, it's decent. I wouldn't say that it's bad, but I'd say it's the last album to check out if you're getting into Fear Factory. This would be the album to listen to last. But don't get me wrong. Just because I put it last doesn't mean that it's a bad album, but just be cautious. Don't have your expectations too high. Don't expect it to be another demanufacture or obsolete, but do give it a chance though. But Again, not really much to say about this album, but if you want to check out at least one or two songs from this album, I'd probably start off with the song Transgression, aka the title track. But anyways, those are my thoughts on how to get into this band. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you'd move albums to a different category, or let me know if you're already a fan and you agree with some of my points in this video and all that good stuff. But anyways, thanks for watching. Please leave a comment, like, subscribe. Have a nice day, and take care.